Well, we are wrapping up the second week of the Sean Diddy Combs' sex trafficking trial. Once again, we heard plenty of graphic testimony from several witnesses, including the mother of Combs' ex-girlfriend, Cassie Ventura. Joining me once again is Neama Rahmani, a former federal prosecutor who had been closely following the twists and turns of this case. Thank you so much for joining us again.
Of course. Thanks for having me. Big week this week in the Diddy case.
Yeah, court is not in session today for the Memorial Day holiday weekend, but there is a lot for jurors to think about over the weekend. Who had the strongest testimony you feel this week?
I think it was probably Regina Ventura, Cassie's mom. She talked about a scheme where Diddy threatened to release 2 of those freak-off videos, sex tapes, one of them on Christmas Day, unless Cassie paid $20,000. Regina got a home equity line, wired Combs the money. It was returned a few days later, but that's important because that's extortion and one of the elements of the racketeering charge in the case.
That is fascinating that she got the money back. So it really creates this sense of fear and a threatening environment for her family as well. You know, in the court of public opinion, I've been seeing a lot of people commenting online saying, yes, if this was a domestic violence case, he's guilty, but they're struggling to make the connection to racketeering and sex trafficking. Of course, they're not in the courtroom. They're not seeing all the evidence. Do you think that the prosecution is doing enough to make those connections for the jurors?
I do, and I agree. This is probably the most common question I'm getting about the case. Of course, you know, sexual assault and domestic violence, those are state crimes. They're usually not federal crimes. So, you know, you have 3 sets of federal crimes here. The first is prostitution across state lines. I think that's proven with the sex workers coming from all over the country. And these incidents happening in New York and Ibiza and across state lines, international as well. Then you're talking about sex trafficking. You know, one common misconception with sex trafficking is it's not human trafficking. It's not like, you know, someone has to be kidnapped and locked up. Sex trafficking is just sex with force, fraud, or coercion. There has to be a commercial element and there has to be an interstate component. So that's why the government here, they're really focused on force and coercion, right? You hear testimony about the extensive drug use to the point that Cassie threw up. That she thought she had to do this, otherwise Combs would leak these videos. That's the coercion aspect. And then you have the force, you know, all the testimony about the guns and the physical violence. So I do think the government has proven its case. And you're right, when it comes to racketeering, typically you think of the mob or cartels or street gangs, but you can't have racketeering in sex trafficking cases as well. We saw in R. Kelly, we saw in the Nexium sex cult case. Racketeering just requires a criminal enterprise, and Bad Boy can be that enterprise with Combs at the head. And it requires 2 RICO predicate acts, and it can be things like bribery. We heard about that last week. Kidnapping, when Cassie was trying to leave the hotel in 2016. Extortion, like we just talked about, prostitution, and of course, sex trafficking. So as long as the government can prove 2 of those predicate acts over a 10-year period, you have racketeering.
Next week also shaping up to be a big one. Who do you expect to take the stand?
I expect to see a lot of testimony from the forensic experts, the video. We know that when the government raided Combs' homes last year in March, they were looking for video evidence, obviously video of the freak-offs because Cassie said that Combs would tape them, but Combs would also have cameras all throughout his house. So maybe some of these episodes were caught on camera. And I know there were terabytes and terabytes of data the government went through, and I think they're setting that up right now with a forensics expert who's talking about the videos that were on Cassie's laptop, but there are plenty of iPhones and iPads to go through. The question is, you know, are we going to hear from victim 2, victim 4, other victims in the case? Are we going to hear from other celebrities that have been named, like Michael B. Jordan and Mike Myers? I think that's really what a lot of people are talking about, right? We heard from Kid Cudi yesterday. What other celebrities, if any, are going to be named and who might come to court to actually testify?
Would those celebrities be already notified?
They would. They'd be subpoenaed and they would have to show up. We saw yesterday, for instance, George Kaplan, Combs' former assistant, who testified pursuant to his subpoena. He didn't want to be there. And I think if you're a celebrity, the last thing you want to do is have anything to do with the Sean Diddy Combs case. But if you're served with a subpoena, you're going to have to show up if you were a witness to any of this activity.
All right, another explosive week ahead for us. Thank you so much for joining me today, former federal prosecutor Neama Rahmani.
Thanks for having me, as always.